We're talking about the case for Christ, and today we're going to look at the area of documentary evidence. I find this personally a fascinating area. Several years ago, I got a tip from someone that there were some important documents that had been put in a public file in a courtroom in Indiana. I went down there and I went through that file. I photocopied those documents, and it turned out they were confidential Ford Motor Company records that showed that when Ford Motor Company designed the Pinto automobile, remember that car a number of years ago, that they knew before that car hit the market that it was susceptible to fire and explosion if hit from behind in a moderate or low-speed collision. And of course, as you know, several people were killed in Ford Pinto fires, and Ford Pinto was charged for the first time in U.S. history with reckless homicide for the deaths of 3 teenage girls who burned to death in a Ford Pinto. Well, these documents proved very embarrassing to Ford Motor Company in the trial that was held, but the judge kept those documents, many of them anyway, away from the jury. As a result, the jury found Ford Motor Company innocent in that particular case, although Ford was sued successfully in several civil cases as a result of fires in the controversial Ford Pinto. But one of the things I had to do as a journalist when I got a hold of these documents was to determine, are they authentic? How do I know they haven't been altered? How do I know that the signatures they bear really are the signatures of those people that they purport to be? So when you deal with documentary evidence, you have to establish that these documents have been reliably preserved and passed along. Now, this is very relevant when we look at the documents that make up the New Testament of the Bible, where it talks about Jesus Christ. In our last get-together, we talked about how eyewitnesses have produced information which has found its way into the New Testament. The question today is, how do we know that these documents have been reliably preserved for us through time? Well, in order to establish whether or not they have been reliably preserved for us, I went and I interviewed Dr. Bruce Metzger, perhaps the world's leading expert on the documents of the New Testament, the text of the New Testament. He has his doctorate from Princeton Theological School. He is world-renowned in this particular area. And I said, you know, Dr. Metzger, we don't have the original writings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're long gone. They're lost to history. How do we know that what we have today in our Bibles bears any resemblance whatsoever to what was originally written by those writers? He said, well, one way that we know is because we have a multiplicity of copies of early manuscripts of the New Testament. And so we have many copies from many different places. We can compare them. We can cross-check them to make sure that they all are in agreement on the essentials. And that's one way we can tell that they've been accurately preserved. Now, the number of documents that we have in the New Testament is incredible when compared to any other ancient record. In fact, the second most preserved document of the ancient world is Homer's Iliad. There are 650 Greek manuscripts of Homer's Iliad, and the earliest one that we have is 1,000 years removed from the original writing. In the case of the New Testament, we have 5,664 Greek New Testament copies, and they are dated, some of them, to as early as the year 200 and beyond. In fact, there is a fragment from the Gospel of John that has been dated to between 100 and 150 A.D. Keep in mind that Jesus was put to death in 30 or 33 A.D. So we have, this is information that is very close to the original writings, and we have thousands and thousands of copies of it. In fact, there are in total, 24,000 ancient manuscripts of the New Testament. And this is unprecedented in terms of ancient historical records. Now, these documents were copied over time by scribes, you know, working kind of in dark conditions, and they didn't have copy machines back then. How do we know that errors didn't creep in? Because sometimes there's some disagreement between what these various copies say. Well, some errors have crept in, frankly, but they're minor errors. For instance, in English, it's very important that you get the words that you say in the right order. It makes a big difference if you say man bites dog or dog bites man. Now, in Greek, in the language of Greek, that the New Testament was originally written in, the order of the words doesn't really matter. It's a different kind of a language. And so even if these scribes get the order a little wrong, it doesn't change the meaning of the particular sentence. That's where some of the errors have creeped in. Other errors have to do with things like spelling. So overall, the purity of the record is 99.5% without error, as best it can be determined by experts. 99.5% without error. And there is no doctrine of the church that hinges on any disputed passage. And so my cross-examination of Dr. Metzger established that these records of the New Testament have been reliably transmitted to us over time. Another thing I wanted to talk to Dr. Metzger about was this controversy over something was discovered in 1945. It's called the Gospel of Thomas. And it purports to preserve the secret words that Jesus said. And there are 114 sayings of Jesus. And some scholars who are very liberal and left-wing like to claim that this Gospel of Thomas is every bit as reliable as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. One of the reasons they like it is because the Gospel of Thomas does not record any narrative. It doesn't talk about the miracles and resurrection of Jesus. It's just a collection of his sayings, of his teachings. And they like that because they're not so sure about the resurrection stuff. They'd rather look at the Thomas writings, which deal more with his teachings and not his miracles and return from the dead. So I asked Dr. Metzger, I said, you know, is it true that the Gospel of Thomas is as reliable as these other Gospels? Is it dated back to as early as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are very early in their recording of what happened in the life of Jesus? And he said, well, turns out he was the person who translated the Gospel of Thomas from the Coptic language into English. And he said no. He said the Gospel of Thomas was probably written about 140 A.D. That compares to the writings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which were all written well within the first century. He said one way we can tell that is the way in which the Gospel of Thomas expands upon what was written by these earlier Gospels. Give you an example. In the Gospel of Matthew, it says, Jesus is quoted as saying, "A city built on a hill cannot be hidden." Now, in the Gospel of Thomas, it says, "A city built on a high hill cannot be hidden." So you see the word high has been written there. Added there. So you see some development there, some indication that this came later. Another example is the Gospel of Thomas says, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, render to God the things that are God's, render to me the things that are mine." That last phrase isn't in the earlier Gospels. And so it's just another example of how this Gospel was written later and things were added to it and things were added in addition to the writings of Jesus in the earlier Gospels. In addition, the Gospel of Thomas says some things about Jesus that are totally out of character with what we know to be true of Jesus from the reliable writings in the Gospels. For instance, at one point Jesus is quoted as saying, "Split wood, I am there. Lift up a stone, you will find me there too." Now, this is pantheism, which means that God is everywhere. God is in this table. God is in this chair. God is under the rock. That's not what Jesus taught in the Gospels that we know are based on eyewitness accounts and are historically reliable. In addition, Jesus says some things about women in the Gospel of Thomas that certainly would not come from the Jesus that we know is represented by the earlier Gospels. For instance, he is quoted as saying, "For every woman who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." Well, that's not the words that you would expect to come from Jesus, who we know from the eyewitness accounts in the earlier Gospels that he was someone who reached out to women, who validated women in a society where women were degraded and considered second and third-class citizens. So we can see the Gospel of Thomas apparently is much later in terms of having been written than the Gospels that we know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that are included in the Bible, because the early Christians knew that this was the best information about Jesus, based on eyewitness accounts, written very close to the events themselves, not something that grew up over a long period of time into the 2nd century like the Gospel of Thomas. So I walked away from my interview with Dr. Bruce Metzger saying to myself, there is very good evidence, given this proliferation of manuscripts from the ancient world of the New Testament. 24,000 manuscripts of various kinds, more than any other ancient document. I walked away saying that the Bible that we can buy in a store and that we can open up and read, we can have confidence that the information in it has been reliably transmitted to us over time, preserved for us, so that we can read the eyewitness accounts that tell us reliable information about Jesus Christ. We're going to continue in this next installment talking about more evidence for the case for Christ. I hope you'll be there as we talk about what evidence from outside the Bible can confirm or corroborate what it is that the Bible says about Jesus Christ.